So our last speaker today is Alan Kay, who's president of Viewpoints Research Institute. He really needs no introduction. He's widely known as the inventor of the Smalltalk programming language, among many other things. Like Doug, he was inspired to persuade computers to become our assistants in intelligent tasks, especially teaching and learning. His holy grail was the Dynabook, a portable personal computer nestled in the lap of a young student in a park who is casually pursuing her own learning path. Alan has 30 minutes. Alan?
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
So they asked me to speak last, and with the lineup of people that were on the program, I figured it would be suicide to try and prepare a talk ahead of time. Because I figured with great luck, all the points I would have talked about will have been covered already. And so the very first thing I wrote in my notebook here was, "Thank you all for coming." But the idea was to perhaps look at a couple of things from a slightly different angle and talk a little bit about the significance of this marvelous work we're celebrating today and these marvelous people who did it. I like to think of things in terms of threes, and we are very rightly celebrating Doug Engelbart, but it was fantastic to have Bob Taylor here, who is the funder. And if you think about the rewards and awards people get later in life, Doug has gotten all of the ones you can get, but there's nothing like a funder, because a funder is giving you that gold medal ahead of time on spec. And moreover, they know that 2/3 of those gold medals, if they're lucky, are going to turn to lead before the end of the work. And so it's the faith of the second group of people who Bob was characteristically subtle about expressing his opinion about how funding is today. I remember him once, I guess 15 or 20 years ago, giving a talk about the 60s and the 70s, and somebody in the audience accused him of being an old fogey, and because old fogies always are referring back to a golden age. And today is never as good as it was. And Taylor thought for a few minutes, and he looked up and he said, "Damn it, it was a golden age." Thoreau, I have a hard time pronouncing it the way you're supposed to out in the world because I come from Massachusetts, and Thoreau is pronounced thorough there. So my tongue is wagging back and forth. He was an interesting guy. And very late in his life, in 1865, when the first transatlantic cable went in between our country and England, he was asked what he thought of it. And he said he was afraid he would find out that a European princess had just gotten a new hat. And I believe that is one of the earliest examples of completely nailing the two sides of technology. Here's one of the most difficult feats they failed. It was, of course, could be used for expressing really important information back and forth, but Thoreau understood exactly who human beings are and what they're likely to do with any good idea. Another great line of his expressed a little earlier was that we become the tools of our tools. And McLuhan used this idea many years later when he said, we first shape tools and then they turn around and reshape us. And all of these ideas are basically double-edged swords. so that every technology is usually done to amplify something, and every amplifier we make can also act as a prosthetic. If you put a prosthetic on a healthy limb, it starts to wither. And so there's this interesting problem of when I make something that is supposed to augment us, how can I help people avoid using it to replace something that we already have and we wind up with less? And I believe this is the fundamental problem of the 20th century and especially of our age now. One of the ways I think of it is that whenever an idea comes along, there's news and there's new. So news is stuff that's incremental on what we already know. News can be told in just a couple of minutes. It's the kind of thing that people are always exchanging with each other, and they often mistake news for ideas. But in fact, news is so simple that it leverages almost everything we know, and it's just pushing things one way or another. And so when Gutenberg did his Bible, it was treated enthusiastically as news. And in fact, they made the Bibles to look as much like handwritten manuscripts as possible. I'm sure many people here have seen a Gutenberg Bible, but they were illuminated by hand after they were printed. And the fonts that Gutenberg used had, I think, 253 separate characters, because every ligature, every abbreviation that people were used to reading from the scribes, Gutenberg copied, and he used the best ink and the best paper. And so many of these Gutenberg Bibles look like they were printed yesterday. And they were treated as a really great idea and also unremarkable. And so, in fact, the Catholic Church, which was in power at that time, thought the printing press was a good idea also. But also when an idea comes along, if the idea is a good one, there's also new. And new is something that isn't explainable in what you already know. And so it's something that people very often find a way of ignoring in favor of the news part of things. What was new about the printing press we saw in the 17th century, when our entire conception of thought changed with the invention of science, and our entire conception of government changed with the invention of representative democracies of various kinds. And this is, the two paired together are not an accident. A favorite phrase of mine from Tom Paine's Common Sense, which was written in January 1776, and before the Declaration of Independence was penned and put out in July, in those 6 months or so, somewhere between 600,000 and 900,000 copies of Common Sense were printed and distributed throughout the 13 colonies. And to give you an idea of the scale of that, there were 1.5 million people in the 13 colonies at that site. So you can imagine the only medium that you could have today that could have that level of coverage for an idea would be the internet today, if you could get a significant number of people to read one thing on the internet. And in that argument that Paine wrote, there's an important line that's relevant to today, where Paine was basically, the title of it was a joke, because he was actually expressing something that wasn't common. It was common sense to have a king, and this pamphlet was an argument against the monarchy. And in the middle of it, he says, well, instead of having the king be the law, why we can have the law be the king. In other words, we can invent a new way of governing ourselves and organizing ourselves, and we can write this into law, and that is how we can invert everything that people thought to be true if we have the courage to do it. And as McLuhan pointed out, you can argue about a lot of things with stained glass windows, but democracy is not one of them. So the point here is that democracy and what it actually meant, particularly in our country, was not possible without a new medium of expression for arguing in a very special way. The old oral ways and the old pictorial ways were not sufficient. And so one of the dilemmas I think we've had in the 20th century is that the electronic technologies, even the ones that are not programmable, have this double-edged sword, this amplifier and prosthetic aspect. And I think many people in this crowd will have noticed how many of the new communications technologies of the last 100 years or so have actually been used by people as a way of getting back into the oral modes of thought that would be completely familiar to cave people 100,000 years ago. And in fact, many of the games we make electronically would be completely familiar to cave people 100,000 years ago. So these electronic devices are being used partially as prosthetics as a way of avoiding the modes of thought associated with reading. So one of the ways we can think about is when something that can imitate anything comes along, like a computer, that, well, we could use it to go back to oral modes of thought. We could use it to imitate the technologies that we're familiar with, like printing and movies and recordings. Or we could do something almost unthinkable, which is to try and ask the same question that a few people started asking the printing press, which is, let's not worry about the news about computers. We understand the news about computers. They can be programmed to do things. They can be programmed to imitate things. What's new about computers? And I think the significance of Doug Engelbart's work is that he is one of the very few people very, very early on who are able to understand that, as Taylor pointed out, that computers could do a lot of things that were quite familiar, but there was something new about computers that would allow us to think in a very different way, and likely in a stronger way than the printing press brought us. And I believe the significance of this demo that we're celebrating, I was sitting right over there, right where that blonde-headed woman was, shivering like mad because I had 104 temperature doing this, but I was determined to see this demo. That the significance of the demo was that it actually took something that was merely an opinion, and opinions are cheap and easy, and even good ideas are cheap and easy, but because of the third component between visionary and funder, we also had Bill English and his team of doers who were able to take this set of ideas and reify it into something that was much, much more understandable to everybody who was sitting there experiencing it. We could actually see that ideas could be organized in a different way. They could be filtered in a different way. That what we were looking at was not something that was trying to imitate printing. And what we were hearing about was not something that was trying to automate current modes of thought, but there was a strong set of ideas, as Christina has just talked about, that we should be able to improve our process, and there should be an amplification relationship between us and this new technology rather than one that is a prosthetic and a sapping one. So I think the jury is still out on whether and how long it's going to take for people to understand this. When I got interested in this, and in no small part from seeing Doug Engelbart's NLS system and from seeing Ivan Sutherland's Sketchpad system and from reading McLuhan, my thought was, well, thank goodness we understand how the printing press transformed human thought, and we'll never wait 150 years again. And in fact, so that was my thought back then. Of course, I was just a 28-year-old graduate student with stars in his eyes about what this stuff could actually mean. But in fact, I believe news, particularly for Americans, is incredibly powerful compared to new. I think of the strong nations in the world, we are possibly the least well educated. And because we're the least well educated, we lack the perspective even of understanding what the printing press did do, and even understanding how our country was set up because of this, and how we were able to argue ourselves into a better state of living. So I think this is the key, and I think that the questions about voting machines, which I think are important questions, but I believe that they are much less interesting than the humans who come to the machines, and that democracy cannot survive without taking much more heed of all the stuff besides the mouse that Doug Engelbart understood we should work on. And the thing that's interesting about this is that no invented system of thought has been more successful in science. It's probably the greatest single invention of the human race. And the invention as we know it in its most effective form is only about 400 years old. And what's interesting to me about science is how poorly it's taught in most countries in the world, especially ours. And what this means is that this most successful thing that has changed our lives tremendously, not just because it was able to hook up with engineering in a powerful way, but it changed our way of looking at things, our very epistemological stances that we took towards knowledge. In spite of all this success, it's actually a backwater for the vast majority of people. And this is dangerous in a democracy where majorities count. So if you think about where we're actually going, we're actually in this very dangerous area now where the power of our tools has completely outstripped the pace at which education can absorb the ideas and to teach in the mass. So we have probably the widest, sparest, thinnest distribution of understanding of the various powers that have been created over the last several hundred years. Certainly the ratio between power and understanding, I think, is at its worst right now. And this shouldn't be, because of course we have the internet, and there's at least 1 billion nodes on the internet, and everybody has personal computers. That was the dream of ARPA. ARPA didn't care whether it was done on a time-sharing system in a cloud or on networked computers. The whole idea was somehow it had to be connected, and somehow everybody had to have their own personal access to this stuff whenever they wanted. And yet, the commercial explosion of what I think are a whole bunch of very good inventions that were done in the 60s and 70s has completely trumped almost all of the powerful ideas that fostered these inventions back in the 60s and 70s. And when I get called on to give a talk, I spent a fair amount of my time in the beginning of the talk explaining what Doug Engelbart and his group were trying to do, because the ideas are not only as good as they were back then, in many ways they're better now than they were back then, because now we don't have to worry about naysayers about whether you can do the technology or not. Now it is clear what the problem is, and the problem is us. That we are actually have gotten interested in whether the European princess is going to get a new hat, and we put that kind of interest on every medium that has been invented in the 20th and now the 21st century. So if we want to make these ideas as significant as I think they are, we have to do much more than celebrate a 40th anniversary. We actually have to be much more proactive. And I believe that one of the biggest problems in this area even more generally than what computers are all about, is that if you go to almost any elementary school anywhere in the country, the chances that you'll find an adult mathematician, scientist, or computer scientist in there helping a teacher help the kids understand something that the teachers don't understand and the kids need to, the chances of that are vanishingly small. So the hell of it is that though we have resources in our professions, somehow we find a way of not going into the schools, and then we complain the hell out of what the schools are actually doing. And yet, if you think about the lag of doing official training, the only way we can possibly make a difference is by taking our knowledge into the schools now. We cannot wait for the education system to try and figure out what it was that we were doing 20 years ago. We have to go in and volunteer to help. And I don't believe that any officially sanctioned large-scale attempt at reforming American education, which has been tried any number of times in my lifetime since Sputnik, all of those have failed miserably because in the end, it has been treated more like a dirty task in the end, and the scientists and mathematicians and computer scientists stay out of the classrooms and somehow expect the teachers to learn things that are almost impossible to learn in the position that they're in. So the last idea here is a kind of an idea from McLuhan, but it's also something that we can notice about ourselves if we go to a foreign country and stay for more than a week. And that is that after about a week, we actually find ourselves acting like we live in this country because we're fitting into the rhythms and our brains are naturally set up to normalize to any environment. And if you think about what normalizing to an environment actually is, it is somewhat like learning to drive a car. When you start off driving a car, there's a lot of stuff going on and it's very chaotic, and what gear are you in and how fast are you going and where's the stop sign and what's your parent saying to you and where's the kid with the little ball on the road. And it's all completely chaotic. And 6 or 8 weeks later, there are little experts inside of our head that are automatically paying attention to these, and that's good. That's what happens when we normalize. We normalize to the things that are expected in the environment by building little experts. But the other edge of the sword is that normalization disappears what we just became in order to get skilled. And McLuhan pointed out, it doesn't matter really what you print in a book. What matters is whether you have become a reader or not, because that has changed your whole approach to how you're getting information. It doesn't really matter that much what is put on television in the first order. What matters is that you're watching it at all. If you're watching it enough for it to become an environment, then it's what's on television that starts creating what's normal for you. It's a scary thought if you think about it that way, and you should. And on the positive vein, if you create an NLS and get expert at it, and that was part of the idea in this system. It wasn't a system for beginners, it was a system for experts, people who were going to spend hours at a computer. Now, some people poo-pooed Doug and his group because they said, well, nobody's going to spend hours sitting in front of a screen. But they knew differently. And they knew if you're going to spend hours sitting in the front of a screen, you might as well get expert at it. You might have noticed that their system's response time is just a little bit faster than you're used to today. So a picture on your screen just this size is 192K, which is exactly the size of the memory on the SDS 940. And it was about a half MIP computer, so you can multiply that out by factors of millions and so forth. But in fact, it doesn't matter because a bad design is a bad design. And if you run a sufficiently bad design on a sufficiently fast computer, it's still going to be bad and slow. That's what we've got. So the flip side of this is if you get expert in something that is good, and this is the whole aim and significance of the augmentation of human intellect center, that then that normalization is going to turn you into a different kind of thinker than you were before, and it's going to turn you into a different kind of thinker than people were in the 18th century, and it'll be a different kind of thinker than people were in the Middle Ages, and a different kind of thinker than they were 100,000 years ago. That's the whole idea, that in order for these huge reforms in our process of getting at the world, we have to get fluent in them. And so no amount of not getting fluent in science is going to help you, because it is actually a way of thinking. And so all of these things have to get beyond the air guitar stage or the guitar hero stage in our culture and get into something that is much more like expert playing of a musical instrument. And that is what NLS felt to me when I first learned how to use it, that here was, the phrase I made up was the computer is an instrument whose music is ideas. And this is the first embodiment of what this incredible new idea became. And I never thought that I would actually live to this age and not see these ideas adopted. And now I can see maybe another 100 years might be required. And here's the interesting thing. It could be because of the computer's ability to imitate television and things like television, that it could be that the current media milieu that we have today could successfully hold off all competitors that have to do with deep ideas. We could have made the most powerful medium ever for distracting ourselves to death. And the shame of it is that people understood all of this while this was going on, and even a bunch of us who were doing it understood it while it was going on. And yet the general knowledge of this was not present in the environment when it burst on the scene. The last idea, and I think this is the real tribute to today, is reality is kind of a low-pass filter. So the average good idea gets low pass down into a dial tone and is forgotten, but we haven't forgotten NLS. After 40 years, we haven't forgotten it, and it's as vivid to us today as it was when we first saw it, and we haven't forgotten the ideas behind it. And perhaps the real significance of NLS is that it put an idea into the world that is a difficult one, but it put it into the world so well that it's an idea none of us can forget, and every one of us after this meeting will go out and try to get other people to understand that idea. Thank you. Okay.